ready to rumble?
Let's rumble.
Let's get ready to rumble. Hi everyone, welcome to Rumble on the River Forum. My name is Dineen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the campaign manager with 350 PDX. And we're so excited to be here down in Eugene with you all. This is exciting for us because we're actually all on tour right now. This is our fifth forum of this type. We've been doing these since October. We have them in different neighborhoods across Portland, partnering with different neighborhood associations and churches, community groups, to really try to get the word out about this issue from all these different angles that these fine, smart folks will touch on today. And it's also being filmed right now, so all of our comrades in Portland who couldn't be here will get to see it. So thank you for that. Yes, we have a bunch of seats up front. Just want to give a shout out to all these awesome organizations who help us put on this forum for 5 times now and help spread the word. And while I talk for a moment here, I'm going to at the same time be showing you this awesome video that our friend Jay Wilson put together. It's bird's eye view of the area that we're talking about.
Can you turn off the lights while we're looking at it?
We could. I didn't want to do sound. I guess it's.
Oh.
Is there a way to not? I don't know.
If we,
It's like not.
Is it a YouTube video? There should be a sound.
There. Oh yeah, here we go.
that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before I jump into this, I guess, how many people here live in the Portland area? Okay, cool. How many haven't heard about this topic about Zenith Energy or the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub before? Awesome, that's great. Yes, awesome. That'll just help us kind of tailor what we're talking about. So you're gonna get to hear a lot of really juicy information from these people. But I just want to set the stage for a bit. So this area that we're talking about today, the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub, or the CEI Hub, it's a 6-mile stretch of area in North Portland on the west side of the Willamette River, on the lower Willamette. And it is where 90% of all of the liquid fuel in Oregon is stored, in the whole state. And 100% of all of the jet fuel that is used at the Portland airport. What we're seeing now, there's a total of 650 different tanks in this area, mostly storing petroleum-based products. We're going to be talking a lot about one specific company in this area, Zenith Energy. They're a Houston-based oil by rail transloading facility. But they are one of many big fossil fuel villains in this area. There's Kinder Morgan, BP, Shell, Chevron, Northwest Natural. And this area is also has been a designated federal Superfund site since 2000. So there's a whole mess of issues in this area. And we're gonna touch on pieces of it, but we really felt like it was important to bring what we know about this issue down to Eugene, because this is all our river, this is all the Willamette River. Everything that happens here, it's connected. And the one huge scary element of this too is that all of this area was built before we understood the dangers of earthquakes. And so this is all on a liquefaction zone. So in the event of the inevitable overdue Cascadian subduction zone earthquake, it's been predicted that there would be an oil spill on the same scale as the 2010 BP Deepwater Horizon, which is the largest oil spill in our country's history. So the fact that that scale of an oil spill could happen in a dense urban center in the Willamette River. It's all very it's hard to fathom the damage that would cause. So it's crucial that we are working to transform this hub and what's in here, and shut down Zenith Energy and really reimagine a new relationship with the river. And that is possible because it didn't always look that way, the river. For generations and generations, this area of the lower Willamette was a system of marshes and shallow wetlands and streams, lakes and forests, where many different tribes lived and fished and hunted, traded. The Multnomah, Chinook, Clackamas, Tualatin, Yakima. These are just some of the tribes who used this area, called it home, traded here, met here, and gathered here, and lived in tandem with the river. And it looked completely different than it does now. And we'll hear more about this history too. And then also, I want to shout out Kate for teaching me about this whole concept too, but fast forward a bit from that time, in 1902, it was also the site of essentially a World's Fair event where over 1 million people came to this area of what's now the CEI hub. And there were, fountains and museums, and the museums had pieces from Monet in them, and these statues and bridges and people gathering, and the whole thing just lasted for 3 or 4 months, and over 1 million people were there. So we were humans were able to build this and then take it down and change it like that. So we can do the same again. I think it's important to kind of remember how much change has already happened here. And it's easy to sometimes forget that we're able to shift it in the other direction too. So it doesn't always have to look this way, and another relationship with our river is possible. And there are dozens and dozens of amazing groups working in different facets of that issue that we'll get to dive into some of them today. And then finally, all of these products that we've talked about that are stored in these tanks, they had to get into those tanks somehow. And some of it is through pipeline, a lot of it is through rail on trains. So when we talk about this issue, we're really, right now, having the people of East Palestine, Ohio in our minds, right? That tragic train derailment happened. Eileen, we got space up here. It happened a month ago yesterday already. And that could very just as easily, unfortunately, happen in our region too. And it was a wake-up call. So we need to avoid a disaster like this at all costs, and we need to use all the tools that we have possible to us: regulation and legal strategy and grassroots activism and land use planning and all of the tools that we have. So we're going to get to hear about some of these tools and learn about how we can all protect this river that we share and the people and creatures that depend on it. So with that, we're gonna get ready to rumble. And I'm gonna hand it over to our first panelist. And I'm not going to do full introductions of all of them because I wanna save time for juicy info, and you all should have a beautiful program from Bonnie on your seat. So we will also have time for questions at the end. So when you think of questions and thoughts, write them down, and after our last panelist, we'll get to dive into that. So I'm going to hand it over first to Bob Sallinger, the Conservation Director at Willamette Riverkeeper.
Slides you can.
It's right, that's good.
I think I'm going to stand up. But
Okay.
I feel like that's the first time I've seen you in writing.
Yeah.
So thanks. So why don't we go to the next slide? So I was asked today to kind of give some context. I'm not going to actually really talk about Zenith as a critical energy hub. I'm going to try to bring it up 100,000 feet and kind of think about what it means to have a healthy working waterfront in Portland and some of the challenges and the opportunities and successes and failures that we've had over the years. Because it is a mixture of a variety of different regulatory and non-regulatory approaches that it's going to take to get this incredibly degraded piece of river back to some semblance of health. And Portland Harbor is really the most degraded stretch of river in the entire state of Oregon. And as I think probably most of you know, the Willamette River flows 187 miles northward to the Columbia and then goes to the sea. 19th largest river in the United States by volume, drains 11,000 square miles. So this is a pinch point, right? I mean, it's right at the junction of the with the Columbia, and then everything flows through Portland Harbor. Next slide, please. And one more, and one more after that. So this is the area that, no. And so this is the area that we're talking about, really, this 10-mile stretch. And then I kind of went around the corner to West Hayden Island, because you also have a lot of industrial facilities going around the bend here. It is just a site that is incredibly contaminated, incredibly degraded, incredibly inaccessible, which is tangled up in this morass of regulatory schemes that have largely been manipulated to make it not only impenetrable from a physical standpoint, but impenetrable from a social standpoint and from a public involvement standpoint as well. And that's not by accident, of course, because what you have in this stretch of river are not only the most wealthy and powerful industrial interests in the state of Oregon, Schnitzer Steel, Gunderson Marine, but the most wealthy and powerful industrial interests on the planet, BP, and Exxon, and Mobil, and these are folks that have incredible power. And the funny thing is, I've worked on this river for 30 years, and you very, very rarely see them. They don't show up. They don't come to meetings like this. They don't come and testify. They don't oftentimes even submit comments. But somehow, magically, things kind of go their way. And that's because they're incredibly well connected. And even our very progressive politicians, and you'll hear more about somebody like Dan Ryan, who did a 180 on us, had the ability to stop Zenith, cold, dead in their tracks, had done it, and then just flipped and hasn't explained why that happened. Again, magic, right? Next slide, please. So when I think about Portland Harbor, I think about salmon. Federally listed species, incredibly important to tribes. Every single salmon that uses that 187-mile long Willamette River has to pass through Portland Harbor. Every single one. When they go to the sea and when they come back. Not only that, every salmon that uses the Columbia River system also has to deal with this. There's the pollution flowing out of Portland Harbor, and also studies show that a lot of salmon tuck into Portland Harbor. Even as they go up the Columbia further, a lot of them tuck into Portland Harbor and then tuck back out. So this is, an incredible pinch point for salmon. Federally listed, literally billions and billions of dollars going into the recovery, but they still have to pass through this incredibly degraded stretch of river. Next slide, please. And it's also home to a lot of other wildlife as well. And I come at this from a wildlife perspective. When I worked for Audubon, we also had an environmental justice perspective, as does Riverkeeper. So we think a lot about that and the people that are impacted. But I also come at it from a wildlife perspective. This is a picture I took on the St. John's Bridge. This is peregrine falcon, fastest species on the face of the earth, drives at 200 miles an hour. This is a migratory route for a lot of wildlife, whether it's aquatic mammals, terrestrial mammals, birds, they follow our river corridors as well. So when we have these incredibly degraded places with so little habitat left, it makes a big difference. And we build our cities at the confluences of rivers. These are historically biodiversity hotspots. These river confluences are incredibly fertile floodplains. All the land around Portland Harbor was at one time wetlands and floodplains, and we filled them and degraded them. When Lewis and Clark came through this area, they camped on what we today call Hayden Island. They called it Image Canoe Island. And they complained, they wrote in their journals, because at night, the waterfowl were so loud, the migrating waterfowl, that they kept them up at night. They couldn't sleep. And the quote in their journal was, there was so much waterfowl around, and it was simply horrid. I don't disagree. This, again, is a peregrine on the St. John's Bridge, and peregrines, as you may know, were impacted by DDT. We wiped them pretty much out entirely. By 1970, there were no peregrines east of the Mississippi and a handful in the western United States. Today, although DDT was banned under the Nixon administration in 1972, peregrines are still seeing the effects of DDT. They cause them to lay eggs with thin eggshells. Every single nest in the Pacific Northwest is still laying eggs with thin eggshells. It's just getting better. And they're making a comeback, and they've been delisted. This is the most contaminated site in the Pacific Northwest, in the middle of downtown Portland. People think of DDT as an agricultural thing, but in fact, they manufactured it under the under the St. John's Bridge. And Portland Harbor is contaminated with DDT and dieldrin, as well as many other things. And this is the most contaminated site in the state of Oregon. When you look at the charts, we collect eggshells and things like that to look at this. It kind of goes like this, and then whoosh, St. John's Bridge. So it's a huge spike. Next slide. So this is what Portland Harbor should have looked like, or did look like at one time. This is taken about 15, 16 miles up at Ross Island. This is at kind of the other end of Portland, and we still have some good habitat. But this is basically the last good habitat that a salmon is going to see until it gets to the Columbia River, and fairly far down the Columbia River, so the island. But what you're seeing here, really is shallow water habitat, vegetation on the edges, mud flats. We got a lot of shorebirds that come through Portland, and they would historically use those mud flats. When a salmon goes to the ocean, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but what they need is about habitat about every quarter mile, shallow water habitat. If you're a salmon going to the ocean, you're going to be about maybe this big as you pass through Portland. You need shallow water habitat to get out of the main stem, to rest, to forage, and to get away from predators. And if you don't have that, you're just going to get flushed out to the ocean and you're going to get eaten. And you need that about every quarter mile. And that, again, is a bit of an oversimplification, but not a whole lot. And so it doesn't have to be a huge patch of habitat, but it needs to be a patch of habitat with shallow water, vegetation, and so on. And salmon cannot go back and forth. If you're on the west bank of the river, you're not going to go over to the east bank. They follow the edges, and oftentimes they go tail first down the river as well. And so if they don't have this kind of a habitat along the way, it doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be spread out on both sides of the river, they're going to have trouble. So all this work we're doing trying to restore salmon on the Willamette River gets degraded right here in Portland. Next slide. And so the Willamette River once was a braided river. It was this incredibly fertile floodplain, lots of different channels, and then wetlands going off on either side. And what we've done to our river is we have channelized it, we've hardened the banks, we've steepened the banks, we've covered them with riprap, we've denuded the banks, removed all the vegetation, and then we've thrown in a whole lot of pollution to boot. This is Swan Island. That's what it looked like historically, around 1890. You could walk across the Willamette River at Swan Island at this time. And the main channel went down the left side of this. This is what it looks like today, and pretty typical. Again, we've contained it. Barbara Bernstein said earlier today, and I liked it, in most parts, you get down here and you can actually see a river. What you see here in Portland is a canal, basically a cement canal. And it's deceptive too, because we don't always, people look at the banks and go, oh, they don't look that bad. Look at them closely. And in fact, they are cement for the most part. We've known this river has been polluted and degraded for a long time. There have been many efforts in the last century to kind of step up and step into it. But they've been kind of piecemeal. Next slide. We kind of written off our urban rivers as well. When I started working at Audubon in '92, most people, including environmental groups, said this is not worth spending our time on. Audubon took a lot of heat for working on the urban river, and it was a very lonely process. People just said, this is polluted, contaminated, it's a cesspool, who cares? And the degree to which that was true is exemplified by this slide. This is Mike Houck, my predecessor at Audubon, a real visionary for urban conservation, and he has battle wounds that he still talks about from other conservation groups, saying you are diverting attention, you are diverting money, you are diverting resources from things that actually matter. Why the heck is Audubon working on a place like the North Reach? Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife was required under Goal 5 to survey for wildlife habitat in the metro region. They didn't want to do it, so they gave Mike a big $5,000 and said, you go and do all the surveys in the metro region. So Mike walked basically the entire region, walked the entire length of the Willamette in the metro region, and mapped habitat on maps that I still have. He circled stuff. It's really funny to look at them because they're as good as the maps that we do today with GIS, but they're a hell of a lot funnier. Like a big red square, really effing good habitat. And if you know Mike, we'll be familiar. We have made some progress though. This is Portland's, this is a sewer overflow pipe. For a long time, we had sewage that mixed with stormwater, and it would overflow, and we would get raw sewage, literally fecal matter and all kinds of other things flowing down the Willamette more than 100 days a year. We had to spend $1.4 billion to separate the sewer system and the Big Pipe project in Portland so that no longer happens. They're still allowed to have a certain number of overflow days, but it's more like 4 to 6 a year as opposed to 100 to 150. But $1.4 billion to undo something that, by the way, we knew we shouldn't have to do when the city brought the Olmsted brothers out, folks who signed Central Park and a lot of other park systems. One of the things they said in 1902 or 3 was, you can gain a lot by, rather than developing along your stream corridors, protecting them, protect greenways, and you'll save a heck of a lot of money by dealing with the water in a natural way rather than putting it into sewer systems and things like that. They knew it then, and we learned it the hard way now. Next slide. So Portland Harbor is a Superfund site. Most of you know that. Superfund is federal law that basically designates the most high-risk and complex contaminated sites in the country, and this is one of the worst of the worst. It stretches 10 miles from the confluence, really from about River Mile 1 to about River Mile 11. Don't look too closely at this slide because it will give you seizures, but every single one of those colored boxes is a polluted site. Over 150 responsible parties, basically industrial pollution. We used our river as a sewer. We also contaminated its banks very badly. People will tell you that this was all historic. We didn't know better. That's a lot of bull. We did know better, and a lot of it's more recent than people believe, too. It was listed in 2000 as a Superfund site. It should have taken, maybe a half a decade to really move that forward. It's now 23 years later, and we still haven't gotten to cleanup. We're still probably 3 or 4 years away. Why are we still that far away from cleanup? Because of those powerful interests. They have stalled, they have obfuscated, they've done everything possible to delay, and they've done that with a lot of politicians who I know, respect, work with, who are complicit in that. But again, incredibly contaminated PAHs, PCBs, diodrin, DDT, heavy metals, lead. It's a smorgasbord of pollutants. And one of the dangers as we work through this is industry wants to do a couple of things. First, they want to do natural remediation. What's natural remediation? That means leave it and let the river cover it up or flush it downstream. It's a nice term for a bad idea. The second thing is they want to cap it. They want to put cement on top of it or natural materials, but basically that will leave it in the river and leave it on the land as well in a way that we will have to monitor it for the rest of eternity. We also won't be able to do a lot of things on those lands because it's sitting on contaminated parcels. So this is one of the big challenges that we're in the middle of, and moving forward on next slide. Along with the Superfund listing, under the Superfund law, responsible parties have to do some remediation, some mitigation for the natural resource impacts they have and had, and also the recreational impacts. We're moving through that process. That's an exciting process. This is the tip of Sovey Island, and you can see it's been restored, created shallow water habitat for salmon, and so we're getting some pretty exciting big projects out of that. Industry was able, however, to go to EPA and say, we're so lacking in industrial land that only half of the remediation should occur in Portland Harbor, and the rest of it should occur either on the Columbia or upriver. And so they got away with that. And that's unfortunate, because this is the piece of land that needs it the most. Next slide. And a few more. One of the big challenges we face is a really hidden one, and I'll end up in a few minutes, because I know we need to move on, but is something called Goal 9. How many of you know what Goal 9 is? Barbara knows it because she's interviewed me like 30 times. Goal 9 is a really, really exciting goal. It's part of our land use planning system, and it is the goal that deals with working lands, industrial lands. And what Goal 9 says is that municipalities must maintain a 20-year supply of industrial land. That's not should, can, it's shall. They have to. And every 5 years, municipalities have to go through a process they call an economic opportunities analysis, in which they look at land supply and land demand. And most people don't pay attention to that because it's not really exciting, and it doesn't change anything right away. And so for decades, the city of Portland has gone behind closed doors with industrial interests and asked them, how much land do you need? Oh, we need a lot. We need a lot. We have people banging on our doors. And then they look at how much land they have, and then they come up with a deficit, and no one pays attention. Why does that matter? It matters because if they come up with a deficit of industrial land, they need to go find more. Where do they find more industrial land? It's not commercial, it's not residential, it's open space. And so they demand that we convert natural areas in the same vicinity to industrial use. They also use that as a shield against new environmental regulations. Since we don't have enough industrial land, we can't have the tree code along the river. We can't expand environmental zones. We can't have floodplain protection. That's not an exaggeration. The city of Portland has not put a new environmental regulation on the river industrial land for about a decade. And when they did try to a decade ago, industry went down to Salem, went to the Land Use Board of Appeals, and got it thrown out. A decade-long planning process to serve multiple functions in the North Portland Harbor was thrown out because we didn't have enough industrial land. So one of the things we're going through this process right now that we're really trying to crack open is this economic opportunities analysis, so that we do get the public involved. We do think holistically about the needs of the community, not just the needs of big industrial interests. And we make sure that we have a holistic vision. And we push back on this bull about not having enough industrial land. Where has our industrial land gone? Well, this is Port of Portland land. This is now a shopping mall. This is Daimler. They put up an office building on their land, Swan Island. This is Terminal 1. The Port of Portland owned that. It's now like $1 million condos. So one of the things we see happen in Portland is industrial interests upzone their land because they make a fortune off it. And then they come back and they scream bloody murder, we don't have enough industrial land. Next slide. Which puts places like this in jeopardy. This is West Hayden Island. I mentioned it earlier. That's the island that Lewis and Clark camped on. And it's 800 acres of natural area. For 3 decades, the Port of Portland argued that they needed to convert that to industrial use because we just didn't have enough industrial land. We finally got a break from the Port of Portland about 2 years ago, and they admitted that not only didn't they need it now, they didn't need it 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they would never need it. And so now we're working hand in hand with them to actually turn that into a natural area. But that's the power of that economic opportunities analysis. It drove literally 3 decades of efforts to convert this land. And by the way, West Hayden Island contains 4% of the remaining bottomland cottonwood ash habitat on the entire lower Columbia. So it's one of the last really big parcels. Next slide. One more thing I want to flag for you before I turn it over is floodplains. We continue to develop floodplains in Oregon from a biological perspective, a human health and safety perspective, a climate resilience perspective. We couldn't do anything that's more ridiculous. And how many times do we have to learn? How many times do we need to see cities go underwater before we figure out that we shouldn't be developing on our floodplains? This lovely parcel of land, anybody recognize it? This is 1996, it's South Waterfront. Oregon's highest density development. And they put a hospital right here. This was one of the biggest developments in floodplains in Oregon in the last several decades. They should have to do something called balanced cut and fill, which is if you fill a floodplain, you have to cut nearby in order to keep the capacity. But in their infinite wisdom, Metro excluded 2 sites in the Portland region from this, South Waterfront and West Hayden Island, because they were so big that it would be really expensive to mitigate for the impacts, and so we should just waive the mitigation. I would suggest that if they're too expensive to mitigate for the impacts, you should waive the development.
Right.
Next slide. And there is something called the Oregon FEMA Biological Opinion. Audubon sued them along with a lot of other groups about a decade ago, and what it requires is every single municipality that has salmon-bearing streams to update their floodplain protections in a way that protects endangered salmon, which is basically a surrogate for updating your floodplain regulations in a way that protects human health and safety in the environment and makes your landscape resilient. It's a little bit of a sleeper, but it's getting a lot more momentum all of a sudden. It's a big deal. It's a game changer, actually. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to talk more about what we came here, which is the CEI hub. But we've also had big wins as well, fighting back against these interests. And this is the last slide I'll show, which is really, Pembina Propane tried to come into Portland. We were told, don't even fight it. It's not worth your time. You're going to lose. We won. That led to the effort to have a fossil fit fuel ban in Portland, led largely by school kids. And we won that too. And so we're making headway. So with that, I'll sit down.
Thanks.
All right. I can do my own, yeah. So my name's Melanie Plaut. I'm a retired OBGYN doctor, and I volunteer and organize with various groups in town, including Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility and 350 PDX. Just a disclaimer, I am an OBGYN, as I said. I am not an environmental toxicologist, so I'm going to be a little bit out over my skis here, but I still think I can transmit some information. The CEI hub, as you may know, holds 100% of our aviation fuel, 90% of all our liquid transportation fuel, so that's gasoline and diesel, for the whole state of Oregon. And it has 150 different chemicals stored there. So this is literally a toxic chemical cocktail that we have in the hub. Just a brief note, if you are in the CEI hub and you're wondering what's in that train or what's in that truck, you can tell by the placards here. So 1267 is crude oil. So you'll see 1267 on the trains that come into Zenith that bring the oil. Now it's mostly from the Bakken region, which is the lighter, more explosive oil, but it used to be more of the tar sands, which also had a white placard for the dilution that was required. So 1267 is crude. 1203, you'll see that on all the gasoline trucks, because all of these tanks that store the stuff in the CEI hub, they get set out in these big trucks and they go to the gas stations in our local communities. And that's where the gas comes from. And then 1202 is diesel, any kind of diesel. It could be biodiesel, it could be renewable diesel, it could be fossil diesel. And I'll mention just one other placard that's not on this slide, which is asphalt, 3257. And we see a lot of asphalt and we smell a lot of asphalt when we're in the hub. So when I was creating this talk, I really thought that there are 3, quote, opportunities for us to be exposed to these toxins. And one is during the routine operation of the hub. So for instance, there's quite a bit of evaporation of these different substances as they're transloaded by pipe or from a truck or from a train into a tank and then back. And then there's also the fossil fuel use of the transportation within the hub. All of these gasoline trucks that we see, all of the trains that we see. Then the second category is sort of the accidental releases. And this is where a lot of the emphasis is on, understandably, a spill, a fire, an explosion, a seismic event. And then the third category, which sometimes maybe we forget a little bit, but it's the use of these fuels. has a great impact on our health in terms of air pollution. You know, more people die from air pollution every year than from car accidents. We sometimes don't realize how bad air pollution is for our health. So when you're talking about the pollutants, I kind of divided it up into two categories. One is the criteria pollutants, and those are the ones that under the Clean Air Act since the 70s, we are required to have regulations that monitor them. And then the second group is the toxic substances, which is sort of everything else. And within the toxics, I think of the volatile things, the VOCs, and that's like benzoene, toluene, formaldehyde, all the things you can smell. And then everything on this list often is solid, and some of these are the forever chemicals that, you know, Bob was talking about that are in the soil forever and ever in the Superfund cleanup site. So criteria pollutants, mostly in the air, the toxics, the VOCs are in the air, and a lot of the stuff is generally solid. Another point is that we have, in general, weaker regulations than a lot of other countries in the world. And even if our regulations say that a certain level is okay, that doesn't mean it's healthy. So there's a lot of huge weaknesses in our regulatory systems. These routine emissions affect everybody's system. So again, we're talking about what is there in the routine operation of the hub at all ranges of age, and all types of people are affected by these multiple health conditions. If you've been in the CEI hub and you get a headache, it's which those of you who have been there, you know that happens, right? Basically, your nose knows, and it's the VOCs that are doing that for you. And some of these VOCs are especially the chemicals that are used to thin the asphalt. So the benzene, the ethylbenzene, the toluene, the xylene, and they cause not only the temporary symptoms that we all notice, but also a lot of cancers. Especially benzene is known to be implicated in a lot of blood cancers like leukemia, lymphoma, multiple myeloma. So that's the one that I always think of. And some of this just escapes as part of the normal operation from the tanks that have these internal floating lids. So here's a picture of what that means. So you have a substance in a tank, and in an effort to decrease the amount that evaporates, you have a floating lid on top. But obviously it's not completely impervious to evaporation. And this leads into the second category of risks, the thing that could happen during a seismic event or other accident. There could be fires that are started by high voltage lines, but also metal on metal sparks. These floating lids can kind of spark as they hit the side of the tank. And of course, fire's more likely because of our hotter summers, our drought, and our precious forest park is right next to the hub. So that's not a pretty picture. So then I want to talk about oil by rail. We're all sort of sensitized because of what's just happened in Ohio. We know that derailments happen. What was in Ohio was not crude oil, but it's not a good thing if crude oil derails. And Zenith brings in these mile-long trains filled with explosive Bakken crude. And basically this is all for export. Okay, so this is not oil that we can use here. It's crude oil that has to be sent to refineries in other states. We don't have refineries in Oregon. So this, we used to send some of the tar sands oil, the local domestic refineries didn't really want it. Some of that went to Asia, but now it's mostly Bakken that's coming in, and that goes to Alaska or Anacortes in Washington or down to San Francisco or the LA area. So these trains, they bring in the oil, it gets transmitted into those big tanks that you see, and then it goes by a pipe under the road, under Front Avenue, into a large ship that goes out the Columbia River and goes to one of these other refineries. Multnomah County did an analysis of these different train routes that carry oil trains, and it estimates that a quarter of all Multnomah County residents live within a half mile of the tracks. and that would be an evacuation zone. You think about East Palestine, what's happening there, and you try to imagine something like that. And then, of course, there's diesel pollution, from the trains as they come through the neighborhoods. Tends to affect the neighborhoods that are already most health burdened because it's the lower income people who live near the tracks, et cetera, et cetera. Bakken, which I just described, that's what Zenith is bringing in. This is what led to the disaster in Canada, Lac Mégantic, 10 years ago when 47 people died. And also what was involved in the accident in Mosier, where we got incredibly lucky because it was a rare windless day. Kids weren't in school. It just could have been so much worse than it was. Same substance that is coming into Zenith now. So the hub is built in a place that if you were going to build today, you would never, ever choose to build there. It's got that unstable soil. It's got the seismic events. It's right next to a river. It's right next to a forest, and it's right next to an urban core. So it's absolutely the last place that you should build. And most of these storage tanks were built before at least the seismic risks were understood. When you talk about how many people might be affected health-wise by an event there, depends who you're talking about. So there's about 200 people who work right there, or in the hub, live or work very, very close. But there's 30,000 who live in the area. And of course, if there's some big toxic plume that settles over the city, like what you can imagine in Ohio, that's going to affect a much larger number of people. And the loss of the fuel, of course, would affect everybody in the state of Oregon. So this is David Campbell. He was the fire chief in 1911 when there was a fire and an explosion in southeast Portland. And this was what led to fuel storage being moved out of the city. This was the beginning of Linton being the sacrifice zone. It was originally not part of the city, and then it was annexed into being a piece of Portland. Okay, as long as I'm talking about explosions, I have to mention one of my pet projects here. So this is it's the only LNG tank in the hub. It's owned by Northwest Natural. So it's liquefied natural gas, which is this deeply cooled gas that turns into a liquid. And it's stored very close to the St. John's Bridge. Some people have described this as the bomb under the bridge. And, LNG tanks don't frequently explode, but if they do, they can really be devastating. This particular tank is owned by Northwest Natural, and the cold box is a piece of the equipment that chills the gas into a liquid. It turns out that the cold box, and I believe also the tank, are over 50 years old, and they're kind of held together with duct tape.
Oh, no.
This picture is from a presentation that Northwest Natural did because they want to be able to get monies from all the ratepayers, all the people who get their gas from Northwest Natural, to upgrade this cold box. And I mean, in all honesty, the pictures that they showed, some are much worse than this. It really looks like it needs some work. But this tank only functions to serve the winter peak, and this again is a Northwest Natural slide. The winter peak, so during the winter when more natural gas is needed to heat people's homes, it's this yellow area that's in North Portland, Northeast Portland, and a little slice of Northwest is served by this area. So I have a dream. My dream is that we selectively electrify the yellow area here so that they no longer need that winter peak from this tank, and we can get that dangerous tank out of the hub. And maybe that could be a model for how we slowly dismantle in an effective way. Decrease the need, get rid of the old stuff, kind of all at the same time. Third category of risk is, as I mentioned, when we burn the fuel, it creates all of these things that we know are terrible for us: particulate matter, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide. And the health effects of all of these have been known for, maybe 100 years, I don't know. NO2 increases childhood asthma, all causes of mortality, different kinds of cancer, adverse pregnancy outcomes. And one of the areas that's really kind of hot right now in this field is the effect it has neurologically. We haven't really thought about the effect of pollution on our brains. But it's quite possible that at both ends of our lifespan, ADHD, autism, dementia, Parkinsonisms, that this could be, a contributing factor to some of the things that are going on with our brains. And we do know that air pollution has been associated with teenage depression and bad calls by umpires. So if you're not thinking real clearly, maybe it's, that we're having a little inversion in Portland and we just can't quite get our brains in gear. As I mentioned, increased risk. Here's the good news, and this is interesting. This was a study. These women were originally enrolled to look at the effects of hormone replacement therapy. Maybe you remember all those big studies a few years ago. But they looked at the air quality in the cities where they lived, and in the places that had cleaned up their air quality, there was a lower dementia risk. Okay, so this is an issue. This is kind of a side note. You might hear about how Zenith has promised that they are going to start handling renewable diesel in the future instead of crude oil. And one of the questions that's come up is, well, is that good or not? I'm just going to say that there are some things about renewable diesel, about using renewable diesel in the hub that are not an improvement, okay? So the transportation that's needed to move the feedstocks or to move the renewable diesel, same issues with that. It's still flammable. It's possible that there could be less soil and water damage because there's fewer fossil contaminants in renewable diesel than in fossil diesel, but we don't really have much information about that. And then there's a lot of controversy about whether renewable diesel is even good for greenhouse gases. A lot of it depends on what vehicle it's being used in and what the feedstocks are. And there's also controversy about whether it really decreases the amount of pollution that comes out of the engines, and that depends on a number of factors. So I'm personally a little bit skeptical about whether renewable diesel is even a good idea. And when you look towards there being a 5-year time frame before that even goes into effect, it looks like an even worse deal. So air pollution and climate change, they come from the same things. They both come from fossil fuels. They both affect frontline communities the most. And I like this term, the pyrocene. I don't know if you've heard it before, but for the past 200,000 years, our societies have basically been operating by burning things. So that's why we call it the pyrocene. And the fact is, everything we burn, we breathe. So burning not only contributes to climate change, but also they think, worldwide somewhere between 8 and 10 million people die every year from pollution. So we really need to stop burning everything. And getting off fossil fuels is not a sacrifice. This audience knows that. Yeah.
Do you want to come back to this, or do you want to just go?
Just do it.
Okay, cool.
So I get to play 2 parts today. Our colleague Elijah, who is going to cover sort of the grassroots activism history in the last decade or so. He's sick today in Portland, so we won't be able to make it. So we'll wish him well if he sees this on the camera at some point. And before I start talking, I also want to just say, I'm having a really good weekend here, and it's really nice to be in person with people again. And getting to talk sort of about the history of activism just reminds me, because what I'm going to talk about is my entry point into climate activism happened about 10 years ago on these very same issues. And so I've learned so much from Bob and Melanie and other people in the movement. So it's just really nice to kind of be back in a place with folks. It was really bad to be separated from the community for so long. My journey in this overlaps with, I would say, a wave of Portland activism that's we're about like 10 years into it now, and you know, maybe I think some of the organizers are like, might be time for a shift because our politics has shifted a little bit, but like pretty successful in a lot of ways. So there are all these people in the Pacific Northwest who were a part of the Rising Tide Network that went underground a little bit during the War on Terror because the government was calling every environmental activist a terrorist, and it was not a good time to be doing a lot of direct action activism. But then the Occupy movement kicked off, and it sort of like brought back a wave of direct action in the United States. One thing that happened in our region is that the Rising Tide Network became really active at mapping a big shift in the global energy economy, where suddenly, you know, for the previous 50 years or 60 years, the United States had been the like biggest consumer of fossil fuels. It had spurred the suburbanization development model that started in the 50s and 60s. And big changes in sort of like where energy was going in the world were happening. The United States and Canada suddenly became the biggest oil and gas producers in the nation by like a pretty substantial degree, and most of that energy was slated to go to Asian markets. We are not a fossil fuel producing region. We're more of like a throughput region for fossil fuels, and we use some of it, but our populations are lower, so it's much lower than other parts of the country. So in order to move fossil fuels to market or to the place where they're going to be combusted, it's not just like you can wish it to happen. You need to build a whole bunch of infrastructure to make that happen. You have to get it out of the ground, you have to refine it, you have to like put it on a ship or a train to get it to where it needs to go, or a pipeline. It has to get loaded, and then it has to travel a long distance. You gotta get machinery to use it, right? So one thing that was interesting here is that the climate movement in Portland started to take climate, instead of seeing it as like a big abstraction that can be very overwhelming, and starting to map out the logistical processes and think strategically about how we as a region could engage with this big, huge problem. So in addition to many of the problems that Melanie talked about and that Bob talked about, there's also like a carbon problem associated with this, of course, right? And many of us as activists were drawn into this work because of that, primarily at first. And the amount of fossil fuels that were slated to go through the Pacific Northwest at that point were astronomical. It was like 5 Keystone XL pipelines worth that were proposed over, I think, like 28 terminals, basically all proposed at the same time, coal, oil, gas. And so it became like this huge like threat and also opportunity as a region for us to be like, well, what if they just don't build that stuff? Like, then, you know, they're gonna have a much harder time burning those fossil fuels eventually. And I'm pleased to say that like, it's been a really successful effort. Like Zenith is one of the ones that missed or got around some of the activism that we've done so far, but most of these terminals didn't get built because of the regional network of activists that sort of like jumped in and figured out how to beat these things back at administrative hearings and politically, and changing laws and rules and lawsuits, and kind of like the sort of big collective of all the things that we do together has been really successful. Next slide, please. So in Portland, there wasn't really a project for us to oppose at first, right? A lot of this was people in Portland mapping this and then lending support out to other communities in the region that were facing these big developments. And then that changed in 2014 when this facility called Pembina was wanted to develop at the Port of Portland. And it was one of those issues where it kind of flew under the radar until there was a public release about the facility, and suddenly, you know, when the announcement came that this was gonna happen, is how they proposed it, and we heard that, you know, the port loves it. This is huge investment, one of the biggest capital investments in Portland history. It's gonna be great. We're gonna get all the taxes. The mayor at the time, this guy named Charlie Hales, was in support, and so like all the big players were lined up to support Pembina. And, you know, there wasn't a lot of opposition from like big green groups in the area. We didn't have like the Sierra Club, like National, or like a big NGO being like, this is bad. And so, you know, like folks like Bob picked it up, and folks at Riverkeeper kind of took attention. I was unaffiliated. I was like just a random activist person. I was like, ooh, that sounds like something that we could get involved with. 350 PDX was just kind of coming up as an organization at that time. And then a bunch of like neighborhood activists and other sort of like, I would say like legacy, like community activists in our city that were affiliated, had networks, kind of just like threw ourselves into this fight with basically, according to the city, like 0 chance of winning, right? But they made some mistakes. They didn't somebody made a mistake at Pembina or at the city, and they didn't understand that they had to get a zoning code change in order to pipe petroleum over sensitive riparian habitats. And because of that, and the city did try to change that, but they had to hold public process in order to try to change and weaken environmental laws in Portland to allow a fossil fuel terminal to come in. And so that's where we entered in and mobilized, and basically through a combination of really good understanding of what was at stake, good sort of legal theories, and a lot of activism and public campaigning, put enough pressure on the city that the mayor backed away and just gave up. The bully mayor that everybody said would never change his mind once he made a public statement, gave up in about 3 weeks of intense campaigning around Earth Day of that year. And so it was a big signal to be wow, okay, we didn't know we really had any power to do anything, and suddenly we just threw into it blindly, not knowing, and then came out of it being okay, this is an organizing model that we can put to use. And then at the same time, next slide please, there was, the city was basically gathering they were getting ready to amend their climate action plan, which is a joint city-county plan that sets out kind of what the next 5 or 6 years of policy priorities the city's gonna have. And so they were gathering signatures right at the same time that they were forced to hold these public hearings. And so all this big wave of opposition to fossil fuel terminal, we were also sort of throwing into this climate action plan process, and got a ton of signatures basically asking for some kind of policy that's going to address fossil fuel exports going through the city, understanding that there's not much benefit for our community in storing a bunch of dangerous fuels that are going to have a climate impact. There's not really that many jobs. Why would we assent to this and let it happen? So that ended up getting in the climate action plan, and then turned into some resolutions at our county government and city government, because we were starting to learn about oil trains and how dangerous they are and seeing accidents. Next slide, please. And then it also turned into a resolution that said, we just don't want fossil fuel infrastructure on new fossil fuel infrastructure. Why would we be doing this? It doesn't make any sense. Next slide. I'm skipping through this really quick. This was a intense period of activism, but just for efficiency purposes, we changed the comprehensive plan. The code change, not that great in comprehensive plan, but it's on there. And then we, after about 2 years of pretty intensive activism, got code, what we hoped at the time. There's my stupid face right there. I was out of town, so somebody made a big cardboard. So we basically went from I would say a fringe group in people could ignore really easily, to being getting a unanimous number of people who are not really knowledgeable in these issues, and not people misunderstand Portland local politics because of all sorts of reasons. It's it's liberal mecca. It's the city government is not, and Bob can probably attest to this going back a long time. City government tends to be very conservative on issues around industry and all the rest. And so we moved people who are not inclined to be allies on this to unanimous code decisions in in a couple years. And this one we're still fighting in court, but it's basically preventing new large-scale fossil fuel terminals from being built. And so that was a model for us, not only this is the first step, or what we hoped would be a first step in a series of policy proposals in Portland, but also something that other communities, other port cities could think about as well and use as inspiration. And then sort of as that was happening, a lot of that activism and energy started to go into thinking about how we decarbonize or make renewable energy a part of the energy that we use. And so, networks and networks of activists coming together and figuring out what's the next thing that we want to do. So we're saying no to the bad thing that we don't like. We got to also say yes to the development strategy that where we're going to get our energy for what we do like, and had a lot of success there. And very creative. I think one of the parts of that period from 2013 to let's say 2019, right, coming up to the pandemic, is just that we basically never had control over anything. We never had control of government. We never had a claim to regulatory authority. We never had a good shot of winning. If you were a lawyer and you looked at a problem, you wouldn't be yeah, you guys are in a good position here. We've never been in a good regulatory position, but just throwing waves of people with the right sort of intervention points and understanding how we do it. So like timing, numbers, and basically like a little bit of like legal and policy know-how. We have been able to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. We have no business saying anything about, like the 100% renewable policy that were passed as resolutions by the city made Portland General Electric not build out a whole bunch of gas infrastructure that they were going to supply electricity from. The city had no control over them at all, but just the pressure made them go away. And side point, they had to like get rid of all of their executive staff and hire like a new company that could actually like do clean energy policy moving forward. So these huge cultural shifts were happening at institutions that we basically formally had no business impacting at all. Next slide, please. And then I'll pass it, that kind of like leads up to where we start our fight with Zenith, and I'll pass to Audrey to talk about that more.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Audrey. I am a staff attorney for Columbia Riverkeeper. I started there in July. I do want to acknowledge that I'm an attorney, so I'm going to be talking about a lot of the legal aspects of this, but really a lot of the heavy lifting has been done by the community activists and organizers. My colleague Kate in the back was involved with the Zenith issues in the community even before she came to Columbia Riverkeeper. So I'm fairly new to the space, but really excited to be here. So we're going to be talking about Zenith in this presentation. So starting from the beginning, this facility was built in the 50s, and it was a primarily asphalt facility. And asphalt is a product that comes from crude oil. It comes from the heavy deposits that are part of the refining process. It has extremely high VOCs, which Melanie talked about earlier. So those volatile organic compounds that are horrible for the air. Just a really heavily polluting industry. This was going on in this 48-acre facility for about 50 years before this company called Arc Logistics came in. They bought the facility in 2014, and at that time, a DEQ inspector described the facility as a ghost town. So pretty just derelict, nothing going on. And this new company came in and tried to make a profit out of it. So they applied for all the permits for this asphalt facility and kind of got everything back up and running again. When Zenith bought the facility in 2017, they were basically all set up. They had these permits running. They got to come in and profit off of the work that this other company had set up. They bought the facility for $61 million at the end of 2017 and almost immediately began shipping tar sands through Portland very quietly. They were all set up, ready to go. Some of this starts coming to light. The Oregonian wrote lots of articles covering how they did this quietly and sneakily and said things to regulators so that they could get what they wanted and turn profit. In April 2019, the Oregonian said, in little more than a year, Zenith has transformed the Riverside Terminal in the heart of the city's industrial district from a sleepy asphalt operation into Oregon's multi-million-gallon crude oil spigot. So this number here at the bottom is the 2017 Oregon total exports in crude oil. That's like a little over 2 grand, basically nothing. And then in the next year, Zenith was single-handedly rose that number to $71 billion in crude oil exports out of Oregon. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted to really focus on the lies that Zenith has told that have been reported on. Like I said, you can find these Oregonian articles if you just search Zenith and the city of Portland. In 2018, Zenith asked DEQ for permission to install 32 new unloading racks, and this quadruples their unloading rack potential. They're saying we just need more spaces to hold the trains, right? This is not going to increase the throughput of oil that we're going to be bringing through the city. I had a screenshot of the document, but it wasn't very exciting. But they do say in the application, no new throughput. Bottom line, they lied to DEQ. Their throughput numbers, which I'll get into later, have skyrocketed since then. And then in 2019, and these are just a few examples of the many times that they've done these shady business deals to get more profit. In 2019, they basically the year before had promised DEQ that they were going to be conducting the adequate training and safety spill response trainings that they need to do. And in 2019, when they actually conducted that training, the spill response training, they used diesel instead of oil. Very different products. Oil's heavier, much harder to clean up. And they basically misled DEQ and skirted that training. In 2021, Columbia Riverkeeper and Willamette Riverkeeper filed a Clean Water Act notice of intent to sue because Zenith had started doing construction before they had secured their stormwater construction permits from the city. They had an application pending, and they brought these cranes in. We photographed the development that they were doing before they had those permits. And that resulted in a $25,000 DEQ fine, as well as a payment to Portland Audubon for $115,000. And these are just costs of doing business to a company like Zenith. You know, you get a slap on the wrist from a regulator, and you just move on and you make that up in your profits at the expense of the people who live there and have to breathe the air. And this is just some examples. As we know, actions speak louder than words. So we've got some great greenwashing from Zenith's website. If you go to their website, it's beautiful. You would think that they're a really wonderful company doing great things for the environment. They're represented by Stoll Reeves, also has wonderful things about the environment on their website. To the contrary, yeah, they talk about how they're leaders in safety and their seismic, everything's all up to standard. They released a report recently. They paid someone to say that everything's fine in an earthquake, everything's gonna be okay. We know that that's not the case. These are their throughput numbers. In 2019, they almost doubled the next year. Those numbers have been steadily increasing, including last year. The 2022 air permit report just came out, and it's continuing to increase despite promises otherwise. So in 2021, we actually had some really awesome success. Again, mostly led by these community activists and people on the ground that understood what was happening in their communities and really mobilized to educate the regulators in this case. So Zenith was operating under these old asphalt permits, which for asphalt, like I talked about, those VOCs are much higher. And so these permits are setting a really high limit, and what they're doing is different, but still bad. And we came in and we said, DEQ, they shouldn't be operating under these asphalt permits. It's not an adequate regulatory system for them. They need to have what's called a land use compatibility statement to prove that what they're doing on that piece of land is appropriate for the permit that they have. Seems like common sense stuff, but we had to work really hard to convince DEQ that that was the case. So in 2021, DEQ actually said, you know what, Zenith, I think you do need to get this piece of paper that says that what you're doing here is compatible with the city's comprehensive plan. In 2021, the city of Portland, who has the authority to sign off on that piece of paper, said, actually, this is not compatible with our comprehensive plan because it is a major change in the use of the parcel of property that they're working on. And of course, Zenith appeals that denial in court, represented by Stoll Reeves, and Columbia Riverkeeper and Willamette Riverkeeper intervened on behalf of the city, and we were really involved in that legal fight to support the city's denial because in this case, they made a really bold decision and again, motivated by all the people who are out there convincing the city to do the right thing. And this went all the way through the Land Use Board of Appeals, the Oregon Court of Appeals, and all the way up to the Oregon Supreme Court, which denied review of that decision, upholding the good decision that said that Portland had this ability to make that decision. Yeah. And now we're here today. And the city took a really bold step forward, and now they took many steps back. On October 3rd of last year, the city quietly accepted a new land use compatibility statement for Zenith, who all this time has been operating under these huge permits that are not appropriate for what they're doing. And under this new agreement with the city, Zenith is promising to switch to renewable diesel in 5 years. In those 5 years, they're still going to be running oil, still doing everything that they've been up to, probably increasing throughput like we've seen. And basically, yeah, has this promise. Another thing that they agreed to is to get a lower permit. For them, it makes them sound like this awesome, ooh, we're gonna lower our emissions, we're gonna do better things, but because they're already operating at that same level, we're really not convinced that it's gonna have any actual impact on the emissions that are coming out of that facility. In fact, the bigger asphalt permit is a more rigorous structure and has more enforcement mechanisms, and now they get to walk down to, you know, maybe the smaller level permit that doesn't have all of those mechanisms. And then, yeah, sorry, one more. 3 days later, that was when the Oregon Supreme Court denied review of that case that was going through that supported Portland's denial. So Portland really lost a lot of leverage in being able to say, hey, we actually have the authority to say no to this. And again, the community has been advocating for Portland to rescind that land use compatibility statement, because until DEQ authorizes that new smaller permit, there is a regulation that says the city has authority to rescind that LUX. So we're still putting the pressure on. The city has kind of doubled down and said, you know, they're afraid of getting sued by Zenith, which, yeah, that is a tough one, but they need to hold strong like they've done in the past. And when we have stepped up to support them, it's kind of a slap in the face to see them turn around and treat Zenith like this. Yeah, at the end of the day, we can't trust Zenith. We can't even trust them with renewables. As Melanie said, there's a lot of issues with renewables. They're still flammable. They're still going to be increasing that throughput. We shouldn't allow them to say that they're going to do something good because they're still a bad actor. We still have a lot of unanswered questions about their plans. So what blend of renewable are you going to be using? The state of Oregon and the city of Portland only requires, their definition of renewable diesel is a 5% blend, 95% traditional diesel. And the renewable fuel standard in Portland ratchets that up over the years, but that doesn't apply to Zenith because they're transporting, they're not buying and selling diesel. So lots of questions about those plans and how they're going to play out, especially in 5 years when the markets and the landscape is going to look a lot different. I've got a lot of things I could say about quote unquote renewable diesel, but I'll try to keep it fairly short. There's a chart over here that talks about the feedstock, so what you need to add into the equation to make quote unquote renewable diesel. As you can see, soybean oil is by far the most commonly used feedstock. That's unfortunately becoming more and more a purpose-grown crop, so we're growing these soybeans directly for this process. Very carbon intensive, you know about the harms of industrial agriculture, and it requires a lot of energy to go through that process and create the diesel itself. And as Melanie mentioned, these burning renewable diesel does have air quality benefits, but those benefits are really only seen in engines that are older than 2010. So by 2030, those benefits aren't really making a difference. And we're basically seeing these old fossil fuel actors switching to renewables because they see a market for it, and they're lobbying for renewable fuel standards and creating this demand for a product so that they can stay in business. Yeah, my wonderful communication people put together this QR code if you'd like to scan it and sign up for emails to get more information. You can also feel free to email me. And yeah, thank you so much for coming to learn about this. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try to speed through a little bit of this because Audrey touched on a lot of it, but can you click to the next slide, please? And the next one. The next one. It's just a good picture. So as Audrey said, we were like in a good position. There was this activist effort over basically like 8 years that reached its zenith in 2019 and was able to get a city basically to embrace the idea that we should not have, if you have an opportunity to get rid of a fossil fuel terminal, you should do that. That doesn't happen very often. Existing facilities are like the hardest thing to fight, right? Because they have all these permissions and things that are built in. And so we basically put this on a silver platter for the city to be able to like do a very popular thing in a legally defensible way. Even in that 2021 denial, they didn't really want to do it, but they just sort of like were walked so much in that, and there was so much political pressure that they kind of like had to go through that, right? So it was good. Can you go next? And then they approved it. Go ahead. So this is why it's weird. And I don't think the story's over quite yet. I'm not ready to concede anything quite yet until the, Department of Environmental Quality signs off on a new permit. Like Audrey said, it is feasible that they could rescind the decision. I think as advocates, we should continue to push for that while we still can and try to get that result. So this is a lot of text, but basically here's what's weird. It is really weird while you're getting sued by a fossil fuel company to be negotiating outside of a judicial settlement for a different permit on the same subject matter. That seems really weird. It is very strange to take a regulatory process and treat it like a contract negotiation. So instead of the city basically being like, here are the conditions by which you could operate, it was totally flipped. Zenith pitched the city with a deal and said, hey, here's what we'll do. And then in exchange for your approval, it basically means that the city is like a equal bargaining partner with a company that's supposed to be regulated. That's weird and not good practice. And probably not legal either, if anybody were to challenge it. The deal basically, even though it says it has all these conditions attached, what it ultimately says is that what the city said no to before, you're not allowed to move and store crude oil, that you're allowed to do that exact thing in addition to all these other things. So the city already set precedent by saying no to the thing that it's now saying yes to. That's weird. The timing of all this is extremely weird. That like we get a favorable decision coming down 3 days after this like pretty like rushed and behind closed doors process. We didn't know this at the time, but in public requests since, we found out that Zenith was like partnering with other industrial users and like hosting these like events on the waterfront where people were like coming in to like learn and tour the facilities, and who knows what else they were talking about at that time. But it seems like, at least the story that I think is defensible, is that both Ryan, who was the commissioner in charge of the bureau that made the decision at the time, and Rubio, who apparently knew that she was going to be the next commissioner in charge of the same bureau, their offices were coordinated and working very closely and really kind of like interacting with Zenith even before Zenith had submitted its permit. Again, during litigation while this company is suing the city and Challenge Power. And then, the sort of last part that's really weird and bad just for the climate movement in general, and I think is becoming embarrassing for the city as people push back, because they basically said, well, we made this decision and we put all this stuff on paper, and now it's gonna be really hard for us to unwind it. And we're like, that's your fucking problem. Like, you made the decision, you have to undo it and take on the heat from that, then that's fine. But like, we didn't make you do this, you did it all yourself. So walking it back is something you have to do. But legitimizing basically like a fossil fuel company that has a total terrible record, has lied repeatedly, has been sued and lost and pays fines all the time, hasn't told an honest word since they've been in Portland, basically like having the city use its green reputation to just like cover and drape a fossil fuel terminal like that basically just cannot stand. Like, we cannot allow that to happen, because the cultural like turning point that sets in a city like Portland is like very bad. It bodes bad for the future of doing green politics in the future. So I think that's basically what I have to say. We are still fighting it. There's a commissioner Portland is a wild place right now for a variety of reasons, but we have a form of government that's going to be like completely transformed in 2 years. So all these people who are sort of in charge of things may not be in charge of things in 2 years, and they won't have the same bureau system and all the rest. But there is this time where these people probably still want to get reelected, and there are pressure points, and the city still can make a decision. And so organizers are just putting pressure on individuals who probably thought they were going to be a little bit more immune to pressure. The person who's in charge of making the decision now is named Carmen Rubio. She was, I think people thought she would be more the progressive on a pretty conservative leaning council with some elections coming up. But it's really been steadfastly like an industry, like just shield, right? Like not only affirming Zenith, but proposing things like industry-led climate planning is their like big thing. And in Bob's world that he's been working on, they're sort of like sending out land use questionnaires saying like, which regulations should we cut? Like which environmental regulations developers do you not want to see anymore so we can like help you develop things faster? So it's a bad time in the culture of Portland city politics and a good time for movements to begin to reinvent ourselves, to add capacity, to like think about different ways that we can engage because we've done it before and we'll do it again. And so, yeah, it's a bad time, but it's also like, you know, coming out of the pandemic, there's a lot of opportunities for us to organize strong, diverse coalitions that are just not going to take the shit anymore and turn a corner in Portland politics. So frustrating, we're angry, but we're also excited. And I think 2023 is going to be a good year for the climate movement in Portland.
I just want to make one more closing point that I meant to say in my presentation, but we're seeing these existing facilities wanting to expand, and it's really, really hard to fight an existing facility. A lot of like new regulations can't apply retroactively to regulate these entities. There are exceptions to that. Regulations for health and safety and seismic upgrades can reach those things because there's such a good reason for it. But more and more, because the Pacific Northwest and our region has been so successful in fighting off these new developments, we're seeing more and more of these existing facilities trying to get permission to expand. So we have to be a lot more careful about scouting out these projects because they fly under the radar a lot more easily, and just really be on the lookout for these sneaky companies that are trying to stay alive in a dying industry.
Yeah. We have time for some questions for either specific people on the panel or for anyone to answer.
Actually, this would be for definitely Audrey and a few years ago I interviewed Charlie Hales after the infrastructure ban was passed. And we talked about Pembina. And I asked him about his initial support of it. And he was kind of denying that he had actually been in closed door meetings with the court and Pembina about it. But my favorite quote from him is he said that it became really obvious that the city opposed this Pembina because he said there were more people in Portland who agreed that Pembina should be stopped than agreed on the color of the sky. And I feel like that says an awful lot about how a politician can shift. And I wonder how to build that kind of reality for Carmen Rubio.
Yeah. So.
Oh, and one more thing, I just wanted to say, just to add to what you were saying, Audrey, do you want to mention anything about GTN? That's what I was thinking. Nick first, and then thank you.
I think Audrey can talk about the GTN.
Yeah.
Sure. So like I talked about these existing facilities asking for permission to expand, the GTN Express project is a proposition by TC Energy, which is the same company responsible for the Keystone XL and the Keystone pipeline that recently experienced a horrific oil spill. This is actually a gas pipeline that runs from Canada through Eastern Oregon and Washington to California. And the company is requesting to add capacity, so adding more gas to that line and increasing the pressure of that system. And that's one of the fights that we're really involved in right now.
And there are weekly calls
Yes.
about that.
Yep.
Right
Exactly.
now, led by World Climate.
Yep, Real Climate
Get on the
is-
call if you want to fight the DPN.
Yeah, wonderful.
I'm following it very closely in my cable show, Locus Focus. So
Yes.
I'm sure we'll be talking about it again in the next few weeks.
Thank you.
So politics in Portland, I think, right now gives lessons for other communities that are facing similar problems where, so as I mentioned, 2019 was kind of the high point politically where we had the most influence, the most like city councilors were avowedly anti-Zenith, pro-climate, wanted to declare a climate emergency. And then the pandemic hit and politics shifted dramatically, right? Like everything went online, like you could talk to anybody more, organizing was hard. And then different problems came to the forefront. In Portland, we had really intense police accountability protests that lasted like months and months and months. We have a housing crisis in Portland, and basically what I think what happened is that all of these industrial interests that you're basically kicking their ass for like 7 years, like laid in wait because they couldn't really oppose anything. It was too unpopular. Like they couldn't even oppose the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which was like a tax to like do renewable stuff. And then as soon as the opportunity came where people were like freaking out about other stuff, they just started bombarding the city on every mainstream media about like houseless problems, like there's crime everywhere. It was like the 1980s erupted again in Portland, just like crime, scare, everything is terrible, be scared of homeless people, they're gonna kill your children, like all this stuff. And then the same people that are putting politics into those packs are the same industrial users that come in and quietly get rid of all these environmental rules. So they're saying, we'll protect you from all these dangers that are going on, we'll get more cops, we'll do all this stuff. That's the same coalition that's the Polluters Coalition. And so they do it under the cover of like a totally different political program. Nobody ever comes in and says we need to like, you know, they don't go on TV and say we're gonna slash your climate programs and stuff, but they do it subtly, or they try to like, just have questions about like, can we do these programs in this way? Is it responsible? How much does it cost? And all this kind of stuff. It's an austerity politics that's based in fear. And it is, I don't think it's just Portland that's affecting folks. So we need to be like savvy enough in our movement building to understand the interconnections between other movements in our, especially urban areas, and not get split off or allow people to play the same game. Because they just took it from the Ronald Reagan era and are just playing the same tune that they played 40 years ago. And unfortunately, Portlanders have not been savvy enough as a voting bloc to sort of see that coming. And we're gonna suffer some of the consequences until we have the election. And Bob, I don't know, you might have some more to say about that as well.
Yeah, another thing to say about Charlie Hales is he absolutely opposed it. Audubon was actually the first one out of the gate, and we were quoted that day. I got a call from the media, and it was a done deal. And we felt like we had to push back hard right away, or it's going to be a runaway train. And we got as hard of a blowback from City Hall as I've ever seen, including from the mayor's office and other commissioners saying, do not waste your time on this, do not waste your organization's integrity and credibility on this. You're going to lose badly, it's going to hurt you. It was as aggressive as I've ever seen coming out of City Hall. So they were absolutely supporting it, and it was a done deal. And it was all this, you know, I started out my presentation saying it was a lonely battle, I think, in the 1980s, 90s. What's really changed is how many people are now in it, how many coalitions, how many groups, how many people have recognized from a human and environmental safety standpoint, these places are incredibly important. Yeah, it was a total done deal, and it was the pressure from people, it was the kids getting involved. I think we need to do a better job of actually directing kids. You know, these big rallies where there's like 5,000 kids, that's fine and good, but I think when you actually get them targeted on a specific issue, that's where it really is powerful, you know, because we're talking in generalities too often right now about climate. The other thing I just wanted to flag for folks is there's a bill now in the legislature that would exempt ports from local and state regulations. And the ports are oftentimes the bad players in this. And it has Democrats signed on to it, like Ken Hill. So our friends are not on our side on a lot of these things.
What, do you know the bill, which bill it is?
That's not my head. Numbers all blur. I'll see if I can find it afterwards.
I can find it.
Yeah, there's an article in the Oregonian. It's
Thank
Other
you.
questions? Lynn?
Sure. In addition to calling our city council, what about calling the governor and our state reps and everybody else to put pressure on the city and on DEQ, both prongs?
Great idea. Yeah. Yeah, I encourage people to save these numbers in your phone as contacts and do the same
I got it, yeah.
for COTEC and your legislators, and grab a sheet from Lynn to get those numbers. Yeah, and I'll also say too that we've been talking about trains and the danger of them. Oil trains move all throughout our country, and there's really cool maps now where you can see how close you are to some of these, and you may not even realize that you may technically live in what's called the blast zone of oil trains, which is between a half mile and a mile span on either direction of the railroad tracks. And knowing that is crucial, because when you call your elected officials and share that you're a part of this constituency of people who live right along the rail lines, your story really, really matters in this and needs to be shared with them.
We have the number. It's House Bill 3382.
Thank you, Barbara.
And did it tell you who's signed on?
See, this is an email that was forwarded to me from you.
But yeah, we have Democrats and Republicans, and a lot of this stuff is being done, not in this case, but a lot of the stuff's being done with the guys of waiving environmental regulations in the public process.
Mark
right
Gamba
now.
is one of them.
Well,
I just interviewed him last week, and he also said some scary things to me about renewable fuels. Like he's sort of supporting net out in last night. So I have more conversations. I'm a constituent, so I'm going to talk to him some more.
He's not signed on as a sponsor, though, according to.
Yeah.
I just heard, and maybe you know more about it, a state investigation or a report that the state is requiring of any corporation that has a tank that's larger than 2 to 4 million gallons has to do a seismic report for that, and that's due next year sometime. Have you heard of that?
I can talk a little bit about that. They're
Will that
in the
affect Zenith?
rulemaking, yeah, it will affect Zenith. They're in the rulemaking piece of it right now. It's an advisory committee that will advise DEQ about what rules to have about exactly the seismic evaluations that the companies have to pay for. And I think the rule's not going to be finalized till the middle of 2024. And then they have some X amount of time to actually do anything. So none of it is going to happen right away. I mean, I think it's a step in the right direction. Some people see it as a Band-Aid. I think a lot will depend on exactly how much power DEQ decides to take into their hands. And we may want to be talking to the Environmental Quality Commission and other people at DEQ to be sure they take as powerful a position as possible.
Like,
Any other questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to, oh, it was me?
Sure.
I just wanted to point out that the county commissioners of Multnomah seem to be pretty good allies right now. And I think, Barbara, you're going to interview Leonard?
I already did.
Oh, you already did?
Yeah. She
Oh,
was actually,
yeah, a couple of weeks
she was a
ago.
little wobbly, but she was late for the show, so I think it unnerved her. But I still wanted more specifics.
But that's another place that we can apply some pressure
Yeah.
on Zenith, is
One more.
with the county.
Yeah. One more question from Kate.
Yeah, I understand about putting pressure on the city. Can you say a little bit about the DEQ process that's coming up and how folks can get involved in that?
Yeah, so DEQ has the application from Zenith for the smaller air permit, and they're writing the draft permit right now. And then once they have that written, it will be out for public comment for at least 30 days. We're going to ask them for more time because this is such a big deal and really a complicated process. But yeah, we'll be making announcements about that as soon as it happens and telling you how you can write your own comments to DEQ, and we'll also be writing a technical comment to get that permit as stringent as possible.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us.